Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode, we're travelling back to the 19th century to find out more about a fascinating story from the time of the 4th Duke of Northumberland. Born in 1792, the 4th Duke was in his 50s when he inherited Alnwick Castle from his elder brother in 1847. Prior to becoming Duke, he'd served in the Royal Navy and had travelled the world afterwards, voyaging with astronomer John Herschel to study constellations in the southern hemisphere, exploring archaeological sites from Pompeii to Egypt, and travelling as far as Canada. He's probably best known at Alnwick Castle for the restoration of the castle, which took place from the mid-1850s until the mid-1860s when the Duke died. He employed leading Italian architects, designers and sculptors to create an Italian Renaissance palace within the state rooms of Alnwick Castle, and acquired an incredible collection of Italian art to display in those rooms, and we hope to bring you another podcast about the castle's art collection in the near future. But it wasn't just Italy that the 4th Duke was interested in. He was also fascinated by the history of the northeast and of his own family, going back as far as the Romans and Hadrian's Wall, as well as the battles, houses, and other scrapes that his ancestors had got into. Among his purchases were some fascinating pieces of furniture that had somehow survived from centuries before in the time of King Henry VII, much further back in the Percy family's past, or so the Duke thought. The man supplying this antique Percy furniture was called George Shaw, and he was perhaps not what he seemed, because this furniture had been faked. To learn more about George Shaw and how he managed to convince the 4th Duke of Northumberland to buy fake furniture, we spoke to two experts. Dr. Peter Lindfield is lecturer in the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University and is a leading scholar in the subject of George Shaw and his work. Francis McIntosh is curator of Hadrian's Wall and the North East for English Heritage and cares for the Duke's rooms at Warkworth Castle, where much of the Shaw furniture bought by the 4th Duke ended up. Our conversation with Peter and Francis is a deep dive into this story of the 4th Duke and a Victorian rogue. Please enjoy. We are very happy to be joined on this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast by Peter Lindfield and Francis McIntosh, here to talk to us about George Shaw and the 4th Duke of Northumberland. So, hello, Peter and Francis. How are you both?
Hello. Very, very well, thank you.
Hi, yeah, great. Really excited to be here and talk about George. He's a great character.
That's probably where we should start with who was George Shaw?
So, George is this really interesting character. Born in 1810, so towards the end of the Georgian period, to a family that owned and operated woolen mills in West Yorkshire. I'm being very, very careful here. West Yorkshire, the absolute periphery of Yorkshire, but on the boundary today of Greater Manchester. So they were from notable families in the region, but they had basically lapsed into minority, I suppose. They were land-holding families in the region who were very much mercantile, operating woolen mills. So we know a huge amount about George because he kept diaries, and his earliest diary is from 1829, when he's 18, and he records going around the country on large tours, daily visiting people and places on these two large loops, north and south, selling cloth for the family. And he, as an 18-year-old, was incredibly independent, traveling the country on his own, taking forms of public transport, so coaches, etc., and or walking. And then wherever possible, he would duck into, measure, look at, record, draw, write about buildings or the bits and pieces of material culture that spoke to the aristocrats of the region he was in. So he would draw the tombs or write about the tombs of people buried in churches, so on and so forth, these grand houses. And he goes into minute detail. He's also, as an 18-year-old, incredibly opinionated. He knows what's good, he knows what's right, he knows what's wrong, he knows what's awful. And he's so precise that you get a really good understanding of his place within the antiquarian world in the early 19th century. So this is 1829, and he's so engaged with this material as basically a agent on behalf of the family's woolen business, that you get an insight into his moonlighting days as this antiquary.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be a woolen merchant, does he? He wants to be an aristocrat, and he wants to have a fancy house or build himself a fancy house. He's really, he's a frustrated person in
Yeah,
that sense.
he's a frustrated aristocrat. He comes from a family that used to be aristocrats, but where he is in that position, he is no more. And what he does is somehow, and his diaries don't exist for this period, but he manages to move away from this mercantile life exactly into what Francis has just said, into this life as an aristocrat. But he's not actually an aristocrat, he's a fake aristocrat who builds himself a miniature country house in Uppermill in West Yorkshire and fills it with all the paraphernalia he could possibly get hold of related to his ancestors, the Shaws and the Radcliffes. And then he starts building buildings, churches, refurbishing churches, building houses, and also churning out furniture. So what's really interesting is he's this huge mover and shaker in Yorkshire and Lancashire and Greater Manchester, really, producing a huge amount of different types of buildings, so churches, country houses, hunting lodges, and also refurbishing existing churches. He's obsessed with the past. That past is primarily Tudor England. There is nothing better than Henry VII, potentially Henry VIII, but definitely Henry VII, the first Tudor king. And he manages to not only refashion his own house in a Tudor style, but also start churning out furniture in the Tudor style, which is not particularly unusual for the period because it's deeply fashionable. If you go to Wardour Street in London at this time, it is literally crammed full of fake Tudor and or 17th century style furniture. It's very, very popular. The romantic interior, Sir Walter Scott's novels, that's really what people were interested in. The Eglinton tournament as well, in Scotland. This great show of heraldry, pageantry, chivalry, so on and so forth. George was of the moment.
He's also, what I find quite interesting, Peter, is that he does all these things and he gets commissioned, as a bona fide architect and designer, but he's got no formal training, has he?
No, and that's really interesting. He's the days of the formally trained architect are sort of not quite with us, particularly in comparison with today. But yeah, completely untrained. So he did everything. He built buildings. He produced furniture. He made stained glass, or employed people who made stained glass. Cast ironwork, so firebacks. Encaustic tiles. The list goes on and on. Tombstones. He would do everything for you. So I think he's this wonderful entrepreneur who was absolutely fixated with everything that relates to family history, heraldry. I mean, he's a heraldry nerd, buff, I should say, rather. He was absolutely fixated by heraldry, and his earliest diaries, as an 18-year-old, he's writing about learning about heraldry. He's mastering heraldry. He doesn't quite master heraldry, as I'm sure we're going to discuss in a little while, but he writes as an 18-year-old about learning all these things, all these skills, and the being able to use heraldry and that knowledge of heraldry to unpick the past and read everything that he wanted to read, so the tombs, so on and so forth. Yeah, so he's this great person, and I think what's really interesting is there is no one absolute list of all the works he did. He's sort of been forgotten. I mean, he's definitely not forgotten by history now, but he has sort of slipped through the cracks. He's just sort of been forgotten about outside of the context of Lancashire and or Yorkshire and or the Victorian society. So because of that, there's no one real work on everything he did. Wikipedia is definitely not right. The Victorian Society's account of everything he's done is not complete. He appears in some of the Pevsner's Buildings of England, but that's not complete because he doesn't just build buildings, and some of the buildings he built are no longer with us. So it's a real detective story to try and work out the full breadth and depth of what he did.
You're basically George Shaw's cheerleader, aren't you, Peter?
I am. Yes.
That is the aim of your academic life. Yeah.
Yes, basically, I've just become George Shaw's cheerleader now. It's and that's my lifelong project. I think trying to unpick everything he's done. I'm currently going on visits to as many of his properties as possible, trying to understand what he did there, and also how they sort of chart his development as an architect and a designer, because it's really quite interesting, particularly what's happened to his buildings. Yeah, so there's yet more to come, but I know no one knows exactly what he did. But if he employed around 100 people from time to time in the space of 30 years, 35 years or so, that's a lot of work. And clients of his, people that he's produced furniture for, or buildings he's produced, they're sort of coming out of the woodwork, so to speak. That these objects are appearing on the art market, and because of his love of heraldry, it's possible to track down who he's been working for based upon the heraldry stuck everywhere on the furniture he produced. And so it's thank you, George, for identifying all the work you produced. So yeah,
once you know what you're looking for, which you do, you're starting to find more, and that's how we came to be working together, really, isn't it?
Exactly. They just stick out at you. It's just boom. There's this light bulb moment where you think, gosh, that's by George. You don't even need to think, yes, that's by, or that's not by. Sometimes there are a few bits which you think, oh gosh, not entirely sure, because he did reuse old material and added new materials to old pieces of furniture. But yeah, it's one of the reasons why we're here today is because gosh, I don't know how long we've been working together on George Francis. A few years.
A few years, yes.
Yeah. Fun, exciting, because George is he's this lovable rogue, I think. He's, slightly naughty or in some cases very, very naughty. Should be sent to prison.
Because you talked about that house in London, didn't you, and how it was all the fashion to have replica, Tudor material. But George made replica stuff and didn't tell people it was replica. I think is maybe the nicest way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, he tapped into a fashion for the past, which was very much of that moment, which is not unusual. But what he did, which is deeply, deeply unusual, is rather than just producing random pieces of furniture, for example, and those random pieces of furniture in the Tudor style match his church interiors almost exactly. So there's an absolute direct relationship between his Tudor church interiors and house interiors or vicarages, and what he was producing in the Tudor style, that he covered in family heraldry and then claimed to be actually ancient. So that's the really different thing. He was making bespoke furniture that was generally available everywhere, but he was producing bespoke pieces, claiming they were genuinely ancient and ancient family relics, and then trying to sell them to people. And that's taking the spirit of the age a bit further and pushing it into a dark place, which is definitely not legal, because at the time, forgery. The history of forgery is interesting, but basically it relates to financial transactions that are not legitimate, for which the penalty was death. And effectively what George was doing was, yes, he's very lucky to have avoided prison and also, frankly, still have his head on. But obviously, people were not prosecuting him for selling fake furniture.
Was he doing it, do you think? And I don't think I've ever asked you this, and I don't know why. Would he be able to get more money if he told people it was old rather than it being, if they thought they were buying old stuff rather than replica old stuff, would he have got more money? Is that why he took the risk?
I mean, the interesting thing about George is, in all the copious correspondence to the aristocrats he's defrauding with the furniture he's presenting as their genuine family relics, is that he's saying he's doing them a favour. It's a good deal. He's offering to pass them on without below market value. So I think, I'm not entirely sure, but he loves history, ancestry, heraldry. He terms it the blaze of sepulchral glory, and it's like Horace Walpole in the 18th century writing about the true rust of the barons' wars. He wants to recreate the past, and perhaps one of the best ways of doing it is to produce stuff, frankly, that he sells to aristocrats that recreates the blaze of sepulchral glory, and has a bit of a kick out of doing it because he's got his claws into these aristocrats by selling what he presents as genuine family relics, but obviously they're not. But at the same time, perhaps in his rather twisted view of reality, he's doing them a favour because his taste is right and he's refurnishing their great ancient aristocratic properties in a fashion that he believes they ought to be fashioned. They should be like that. And so, really, the fact he's presenting them as genuine historic objects when they're basically produced the week before matters neither here nor there, because he's reinstating the true taste in whichever aristocratic house he's targeted.
So he's maybe doing it to make a bit of extra money, and I don't know, maybe he's a thrill seeker and likes the danger. But also, didn't you say that he sort of basically loves aristocrats and wants to be friends with them, wants to be them as well? So maybe is he trying to do it to get in with them because he thinks it'll...
Perhaps, yes, as an artistic advisor, yes. I think that there's a very, very curious sort of vicarious relationship potentially going on. And he was, he was actually quite a mover and shaker. He's sort of living his life through the aristocrats because he knew that his own families, once the Shaws and the Radcliffes, were real aristocratic powers in the region. And in some way, by doing this, he's vicariously rekindling a lost status, which is seemingly all he was interested in.
So is this where the fourth Duke of Northumberland comes into the story?
Yeah, so the fourth Duke is one of Shaw's aristocratic targets, victims, I don't know. So we've got, Peter's mentioned the letters, but Shaw writes a lot of letters to a lot of people, and we're really lucky that you guys at Alnwick have all the copies of the ones that Shaw wrote to the fourth Duke, to Algernon. He writes a letter, the first letter, which is the 30th of July, 1847. And it's quite short, but I think it's worth reading out because it gives you a really good sense of him. So it says, "My Lord Duke, a friend of mine has some magnificent old carved oak furniture, said to have come from Wrestle Castle, when that noble old house appertaining to your Grace's family was pulled down in the great Civil War, in the time of Charles I. The furniture is of the richest and most quaint fashion, and varies in date and style from the later part of Henry VIII to Elizabeth and James I. There are a profusion of armorial insignia, badges, coats of arms, etc., belonging to the House of Northumberland. Should your Grace feel any interest in these relics, I shall be happy to send you sketches and to be the medium of their purchase, the pressure of the times compelling their proprietor to part with them. Believe me, your Grace's most humble and faithful servant, George Shaw." And all the other letters continue on that. It's this real sort of flowery style, but also he's got his story. He's thought about this. He's thought, right, he knows where the Percy family's castles and, old holdings were that don't exist. So it's a story that could be believed. He's got all this thing, of all these insignia that belong to the House of Northumberland. And, it's a fudgy enough. It's like, oh, I'm doing it for somebody else. So you can't ask me too many details. And as, anyone who's visited Alnwick and done any research on the Percys know, the fourth Duke was very into his family history and recreating that and bringing this. So he was a perfect target for that. And it goes on from there. So the Duke obviously responds positively. So George sends him some information and he says, yes, you can send me stuff. So in October, he sends 2 buffets, which are sort of sideboards, aren't they, I think, a clock, 2 mirrors, 2 tripods, which we think are to do with the fireplaces, and a state bed. And that comes to £230, which is a lot in 1847.
So that's the beginning.
That's the beginning, and there's lots of letters. And as Peter says, George is saying to the Duke, "Oh, this would be perfect. It'll fit your castle." He's trying to give him interior design advice, even though they've never met. And I don't know if George ever made it to Alnwick or not, but he is emboldened. So he writes again. He says, "Well, my friend has got some more." So in November, he sends a chest of drawers, 2 andirons, so more things for the fireplaces, a cupboard and a guardrobe. That's £326. And both those are paid, and that's all fine. And they have quite a lot of letters back and forth between them. And then he gets overconfident. And so in March, in 1848, he sends a table, 2 benches, a set of drawers on a stand, and another bed, and bills the Duke for £129. Now, he's pushed it too far because the Duke didn't ask for the third lot. And the Duke also knows a bit about, how much of this stuff should still be in existence. And this is all quite a lot. And the Duke starts to send letters asking George for more detail, and also starts to send people to visit George to try and find out what's going on. He starts to get suspicious about the quantity, and also the it's not mentioned in any of the letters, but we do know, because the furniture still exists, that George has made mistakes, hasn't he, in the heraldry on there, Peter? And it starts to sort of unravel. And in some of the letters that keep following, George is desperately begging for the money, and you do feel a bit sorry for him. I mean, I don't know if he was in such a perilous financial state, but in July 1848 he said, "My most disastrous affairs mean I have to beseech you to pay me this money." In May 1849, "I may beg further that you send me this money." In February 1850, so it's a long time, 2 years later, "Would you kindly order me payment of the last transmission?" And he doesn't get the money until September 1850. And I get the feeling, Daniel and the other team, and you'll know the Duke more, but he kind of just gets worn down. He just thinks, "I'm just going to pay him, get rid of him," because £129 is quite a lot to George, but maybe to the Duke it's not. And he's just decided to just do it. But in the letter that he sends the cheque, the Duke writes in this letter, he has a feeling of regret that the ingenuity you evidently possess should not have been better employed. So he's kind of shaming George, isn't he, Peter? And saying, "You've conned me, and fine, I'm paying, but I'm disappointed in you."
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful assessment, isn't it? That he's clearly got a lot of ingenuity, but the way in which he's directed it is a bit morally reprehensible and/or disappointing, and/or really you should be doing better stuff with your time, George. Come on. I mean, this is a really interesting thing, I think, about the correspondence between Shaw and Algernon Percy. It's a sort of this absolutely brazen, self-righteously determined, authoritative truthfulness in everything he's doing, which is absolutely deeply deceptive. And also, when you look at the furniture, absolute nonsense. I mean, it's just hilarious. And when he writes as an 18-year-old about studying heraldry and 2 weeks later becoming proficient in the art of heraldry, the science of heraldry, it's not the art of heraldry, it's the science of heraldry, he was proficient in the science of heraldry, to then, with this scheme, send furniture up to the Duke, which has got the wrong heraldry. So it's, without getting into technicalities, he's carved 3 diamonds on the shield or fusils rather than 5. It's a bit of a blunder. And if I was in his position, I would have made sure that the heraldry was correct. I don't know. What do you think, Francis?
I think so. That seems like an easy thing to have fixed, doesn't it? Because the Duke wouldn't necessarily know if the furniture was old or not, so George puts a black stain on all of his furniture to make it look old, and the Duke is obviously not, an expert in furniture and historic furniture. So if it's being sold to him, he probably wouldn't have a reason to suspect. But when it comes and it's got the wrong heraldry on it, that's got to have raised suspicions. And he sends the Duke sends quite a few people, doesn't he, to try and find Shaw and get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's this wonderful letter. I think it's suspected the 10th of May 1848, where Richard Byrd is sent to Shaw's house in Upper Mill, and he records describing it and all the ancient style furniture that Shaw has in his house, which he made for himself. And one of these beds is now on public display close to Manchester and is claimed to be the oldest bed in the kingdom, which is not the case because all the heraldry is by him in a very imaginative fashion. But anyway, this Richard Byrd, actually, George does make a few slip ups beyond this heraldry. He makes a slip up where, well, Richard Byrd writes of Shaw having offered him a cast of a fireback or covered in the arms of Henry VII, first Tudor king, which Byrd writes is by Shaw's design. Now, the exciting thing is, so Shaw is fessing up. Not only does Shaw not realise that this Richard Byrd is basically making an assessment of Shaw and his veracity as a collector of genuine historical relics, or is he a peddler of fakes?
Yeah, Shaw doesn't know that Byrd has been sent to spy on him by the Duke. He just thinks he's a potential other customer, so he's trying to show him what he can do. And it's okay to make replica Tudor furniture because people are doing that.
Yeah.
So he doesn't think anything of it. He doesn't realise he's being checked because he's selling genuine furniture.
Yes. But the problem is that he then, to the person checking up on him, he offers to sell him a cast iron fireback with the arms of Henry VII of his own design. The problem is, the year before that, Shaw wrote to the Duke of Northumberland offering him 2 cast iron firebacks of this pattern, which he claimed to be the Duke's ancestral property, part of this cache of old material that he was reuniting. So, in other words, Shaw has just, to the agent, checking up on whether or not he's bona fide or not, just admitted to being a forger, which is a bit silly. But also, and this is what's, I think, also really fun, is that in parallel with what he's sending up to the Duke of Northumberland, he's duping a few other people. And what's I find really interesting is they're being duped through letters which are set up, the schemes are set up in exactly the same way from person to person. But Shaw writes to one of the Duke's agents about having repaired and so basically fixed this ancient furniture before sending it up to the Duke. And unfortunately, that was part of the scheme or the process for another of George's clients, dupes, not the Duke. So when Shaw writes about having done this to the furniture, the Duke's agent gets rather uppity and says, well, this is the first time you ever mentioned this. What's going on? So I think he just gets a bit too carried away with duping too many people. So naughty George, he should have focused a bit more on, what he said to each person rather than.
Yes, the agent says, if it has been repaired, it greatly detracts from its value, and you did not say this before. So George has got, multiple strands of his conning, and he's conning, all sorts of other aristocrats, isn't he? The Earl of Derby, the Earl of Bradford, at the bare minimum, and he's mixed up what he said to who, and that's what starts to catch him out. He seems to have too many sort of, balls in the air, I suppose. And because he's also selling replicas that people know are replicas, you get yourself tied, to other people too. So he's got some people who say, please can you make me a fake Tudor bed? Please can you make me a fake Tudor sideboard? And he's doing that. But he's also got, on the other side, people who are getting things they think are not fakes, they think are genuine, and he just seems to be trying to do too much, doesn't he? I think Peter, and is getting caught out. And you do feel for George because you think he's trying to make some money, and employing 100 people is no mean feat. If that village had been relying on the woolen mill for employment, and the woolen mill had gone downhill, and we know that it goes out of business. George, being in the business he's in now, he's probably kept that village going, and he's managed to pay all these people, etc. So that's a really good thing, And then another thing you can say, well, the Duke's got loads of money, it doesn't, £120 is nothing to him. I just think he's gone too far and he's got too cocky, hasn't he? Like you say, Peter, and stretched himself with his third batch. That's what it does. And I think he needed a secretary or something to keep everything in line, so he knew what he'd said to who. He likes a hodgepodge, doesn't he? So even in some of his furniture that he's sending to the Duke, most of it is new, but there are older bits in there. So
Exactly.
one of the sideboards, it's got 17th century woodwork at the back of it, but he's just used it as the back, and then the rest is the front. So he's he's a good recycler,
Yes.
saving money and then making it more confusing as well.
It's great because that reuse of old material, collecting material, representing it, sticking coats of arms on it, is exactly what he did for himself. And like any good aristocrat, or want-to-be aristocrat, he wrote an account of the collection of the objects in his house that he reolded in Upper Mill. It's hilarious. It's actually completely hilarious, but it's exactly what he did for the Duke of Northumberland, really, because he supplied everything for the Duke of Northumberland to have Alnwick refashioned in this great antique style. And I mean, there's this wonderful letter, isn't there, Francis, where he tells, I mean, this is ridiculous. He tells the Duke where all the furniture, where all the ancient family furniture should be put in Alnwick Castle to give the best picturesque, romantic effect. I mean, he's that's just sort of.
Yeah, it's something that the Duke did not go for, because within a couple of years of these letters, Alnwick Castle is being remodelled, but in the style of the Italian Renaissance. If he ever had an interest in George's furniture, it has gone from Alnwick at this point. And what happens to the furniture that he ended up with, the stuff that he eventually paid for, it's not at the castle anymore, but it is still in a Percy property.
That's right, it's at another castle. It's at Warkworth Castle, which was obviously another ancestral home, and it's currently managed by English Heritage, who I work for. And the Duke was planning to refurbish Warkworth Castle. He wanted to refurbish the entire keep. He employed Anthony Salvin to create designs. For financial reasons, only 3 rooms were ever refurbished, and the restoration took place 1853, sort of 53, 58, and that's where all the furniture went. And you could say, oh, that's great, because basically he's refurbishes it to look like a Tudor castle space, so these pieces fit perfectly. We could also say, oh, he's just hiding it away because he doesn't want to throw it away because he spent all this money on it, but he doesn't want it at the castle because it doesn't fit his scheme, and he doesn't want to accept that he's being conned. But the pieces do fit perfectly, so almost everything other than the beds go there, and we call them now the Duke's rooms at the castle, because to sort of differentiate them, and they're the only 2 rooms that have got any furniture in that are, furnished, and they then decorated the rooms to sort of fit that. So the Duke and his wife bought tapestries when they were in Rome. The tapestries are no longer there. They're now in your beautiful chapel at Alnwick Castle, and also embossed leather that they saw when they were on the travels in Venice. So they lavishly decorated these rooms. And the rooms were for the Duke to bring visitors to and to show off, because for the 4th Duke, the history of his family was important, and showing the sort of wider remit of the Percys was important. So they would come and have picnics. So one room was the luncheon room, the other one was the withdrawing room, and from the withdrawing room is a smaller one, and when you look out the windows there, you can look into the wider castle grounds. He'd be able to show the visitors, this is my other castle, and sort of talk about the history of the site. There was at least 2 royal visits that we know of to there that came. So Queen Mary came in August 1924, and she was taken to the castle, given a picnic in the Duke's rooms, and then they went to see the Hermitage, because again, that's a sort of important part of the Percy family history. And there is a letter from 1902 from the Duke's sister saying that, oh yes, we knew we were being duped, but we decided to go along with it because we liked this stuff and we knew it would fit in the Duke's rooms. Now, the Salvin plan started in 1849, so maybe the Duke had got thoughts about doing the Duke's rooms, when he got his letter in July 1848 from George. But I think it was probably just convenient, and I don't. From the letters which are in your archive at Alnwick Castle, he definitely didn't think he was being duped at the beginning. He knew by the end, and that's why he didn't pay for 2.5 years. But what's really fascinating, another little twist, is that when we've been looking at the furniture, more recently with Peter and with volunteers that we've recruited to open up the rooms, we've found that there's stickers on the back that suggest he took at least 2 pieces to the Great Exhibition in Manchester in 1857. And what we don't know, because the catalogue doesn't say, is whether he was taking them and telling everyone they were Tudor pieces, or whether he was taking them and telling them, oh, look, here are some wonderful, revival pieces that I've had made to hark back. And it just adds another layer of that complexity. You think, well, did he think, well, I was con, so everyone else will be in it, it'll be fine. I can just tell them it's old and they don't know. But the story is definitely not complete, is it?
No. And also, what's remarkable, earlier this year, we were, when we were photographing the furniture, there's lots of chalk writing on the backs of the piece of furniture, stating where they should go. Some of the writing's a bit difficult to read, but it's definitely there. It's great to see that sort of that later history. And actually, one of the it's called a buffet or a sideboard, or to use IKEA parlance, shelving unit. It's a really weird thing, actually. And in itself, this pair of, well, they're basically bookcases, aren't they? Really, they're really weird things, but actually they relate to a really, really exceptional survival. A Tudor bed made in Lancashire around, well, for Adam and Alice Hulton, we think, around the end of the 15th century for their marriage. Fast forward to 1827. One of the Hultons, a FIFA, so a trustee of Chetham's Library, the oldest free public library in the English-speaking world, gifted this bed in this sort of buffet sideboard configuration. And Shaw, in 1829, writes about having seen it, having visited Chetham's Library, etc. And he seems to have reproduced it. But this sideboard-type library bookcase buffet thing sort of infiltrated Shaw's work, and he starts churning out. He doesn't just churn out these buffets for the Duke of Northumberland or the Earl of Derby, of which one is now in Hever Castle in Kent, in the New Berlin apartments. He produced others for the Mosleys at Ralston Hall in Staffordshire, and the list goes on and on and on. He seems to recycle not only the ploys for duping aristocrats, but also the types of furniture and the decorative language. So I don't know. It's really exciting. And actually, that buffet which went to Manchester, and interestingly, going to Manchester, it's basically going home.
Yes.
It's rather close to where where it was produced. It was cut in half, wasn't it, Francis? Because the staircase at Warkworth, whilst big, the furniture's bigger, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it's a spiral staircase to get up to the Duke's rooms, and quite a lot of the furniture to get into the Duke's rooms had to be cut in half, or the legs had to be taken off. And it's just very interesting that they thought they would take it, and we don't know why. And I also wonder, because often when you read things about sort of 19th century, aristocratic families, you say, well, they all knew each other because there wasn't very many of them. They all meet at the same social occasions, etc. They all have their houses in their sort of own counties, but they'll have London houses and they'll get together. And I just think, did none of them ever talk to each other? Because they were getting given identical furniture. Peter's shown me a picture of the sideboard that the Earl of Derby has, and the only thing different is the heraldry on it. It's exactly the same, and there's a certain detail which is sort of this. It's called bratishing, and it's sort of like a half circle. And you can just imagine somebody in Shaw's workshop. That's probably all they made, because it was made by the meter. It's on nearly every piece we've got, and it's the same. Everything, and they will be making it to put it on the replica furniture that people knew was replica, but they made the exact same thing to put on the genuine old furniture. And I'd love to know what the people at the workshop thought of it. They probably thought it was great fun because, they're all probably working class and they think, well, if it gives us a wage, then, fair play to George. But I just think it's fascinating to think of sort of the logistics of making all this furniture and how he chose who he's going to con. Is quite interesting as well, because we only know for certain a few of them because we've got the letters to back it up, because Peter might have recognised more shore furniture elsewhere, but we don't know if they knew what they were buying. Did they know they were buying shore furniture, or did Shaw con them to say it was old? And so we need more people to look in archives, don't we, I think, Peter, and see, do what Alnwick did and open up their archives for us and share that extra level of information.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And until you see the handwriting, you can't say for certain whether or not it was sold as a genuine Tudor piece or not. But I think that there's a lot more. There's a lot more out there, and I don't think it's just the Duke of Northumberland. But as Francis said, this language of design is the same on the Tudor furniture or the fake Tudor furniture as is church furnishing. And the other thing is, the one thing that you have to remember about George is, despite all the evils that he was perpetrating on the aristocrats of the kingdom, he also went to church twice on Sundays, particularly if he missed church an earlier date. He was very, very firmly Church of England and was friends with all the vicars in the region. So he's this God-fearing forger.
He's a brilliant character, and it's a really interesting part of the story for the Duke and for the castle as well. And it's really nice that now people can actually go to the Duke's rooms at Warkworth and see the furniture and find out more about this story. So I guess the final thing to say is, how can people find out a little bit more? How do you get to go to see the Duke's rooms and see George's furniture? And what would you like people to kind of take away from that about who George was?
Well, so we now have the Duke's rooms open with volunteers in the rooms. There's a bit more information on the English Heritage Warkworth Castle website about the timings. And it used to be that a long time ago the Duke's rooms were open and people came and had a look in them but didn't tell the shore story. But Peter and I have fully indoctrinated our volunteers so that one of them now says, when he's coming to volunteer at Warkworth, he's going to the shore face rather than the coal face, because he's thinks the story is just wonderful. And so people can come and have a look. And we're also hoping we'll be able to get more information on the website of the English Heritage website. But Peter has got a small book that he's published with Shaw's letters, but also there's a website about a project we've been working on about the Shaw network that people can have a look at. But if you just Google George Shaw at the moment, it doesn't really give you very much, does it?
No. So there's a lot more work to do, I think, in terms of unpacking Shaw. But it's very much a current project, working with English Heritage, with Francis at Warkworth, and a few other Shaw-related sites. But hopefully, there's more to come. And yes, as Francis said, I've just recently published through the Cheetham Society an 85,000 word book of transcriptions and edited transcriptions of George's diaries and correspondence, which, through the generosity of the Duke of Northumberland estate, I've managed to transcribe all of his letters, all the letters concerning the shore furniture, which is wonderfully hilarious, actually, to see just how incredibly, ridiculously forthright he was. So there's lots of work in progress, but it's I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, George signs himself humble servant, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't feel entitled to be able to give his very strong opinion on what the Duke should buy and where he should put the furniture and how he should decorate his house, and try to give him a history lesson.
Absolutely, he was the proper schoolmaster. He was telling the Duke what is right. Yes, I think, and that makes him lovable, doesn't it, Francis? I think, because when we were doing sort of preparatory training last year for volunteers at Warkworth, there was, I wouldn't say pushback, but there was slight reticence towards focusing on this particular aspect of Warkworth's history. rather than this amazing castle which has survived so much history. But by the end of, I remember getting some emails saying by the end of this training, they were just hooked. And actually, it's not just brown furniture that's boring and says nothing at all, but actually, you suddenly get this wonderful insight into the 19th century's love of history, this chivalric past, and then also this person, this small person from Uppermill, who is just churning this stuff out by the meter, and you know, basically being Robin Hood. Well, frankly, he's looking after his workforce at a time in an area where the woolen industry was not doing particularly well. So he is actually looking after a large number of people through this wonderful enterprising.
Yeah, that's a nice note to end on, I think, with the Robin Hood comparison, the Victorian Robin Hood. So thank you both very much for telling us the full story of George Shaw and the 4th Duke of Northumberland on this month's podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
To see some of George Shaw's furniture bought by the 4th Duke, you can visit the Duke's rooms at Warkworth Castle on select days. Please visit their website for more information. And for more from Francis on the Alnwick Castle podcast, you can head into our back catalogue and look for episode 17, Hadrian's Wall and the Rudge Cup. And to see beautiful furniture not made by George that ended up in the 4th Duke's staterooms, as well as the tapestries that were purchased for Warkworth originally, you can visit us here at Alnwick Castle, where the interiors still have that Italian style that the 4th Duke wanted back in the 19th century. We hope you enjoyed this look into a fascinating tale from Victorian history. We'll be back next month with another episode and a very special guest. But until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.